Welcome to the Seeker's Table. We're a community of hopeful people built around spiritual intimacy, contemplative practices, and authentic relationships. My name is Ian White Marr, and at the Seeker's Table, we're guided by three beliefs: contemplative practice, meditation and prayer, and how that's essential for spiritual insight, that the sacred is a communal encounter, that there's a mutuality to the divine and to God, and that by companioning others, we become true students of the path. So, in an effort to help you explore your journey into God, into the divine, each week I interview a spiritual companion with experience in one of our 8 important competencies that we feel are necessary for the spiritual journey. Today, my guest is Zeena Regis, who has worked in hospice and palliative care as a chaplain and as a bereavement coordinator since 2012. She has a master's and MDiv from Columbia Theological, where she received the H.J. Riddle Memorial Award for Excellence in Pastoral Care. And she's the founder of the Threshold Planning Project and is a grief specialist. You can find out more by visiting zeenaregis.com, and I'll also have all of this stuff in the show notes. So thank you for coming on the show today, Zeena. I really appreciate
I'm
it.
so happy to be here.
I thought we would start with a quote from an article you wrote on Medium. And it's a little bit longer, but I really appreciated your perspective. And you wrote, "Many families will decline a visit as soon as they hear the word chaplain. And I think I understand why. Hospice admission often represents a devastating shift in focus from curative pursuits to comfort care. In most situations, no matter how necessary the shift is, the move from aggressive treatment to symptom management can feel like admitting defeat. Coming onto hospice service brings with it many emotional, spiritual, physical, and logistical challenges. So I can see how scheduling one more visit and having one more person come to your home and perform an assessment just seems overwhelming. The chaplain is yet another stranger standing between you and some semblance of normalcy in this unimaginable situation. I hear you, but please let us come in service of a larger goal: good hospice care."
Mm.
And I just found that passage so moving, and I'll put a link to the article for those who are interested in the show notes. But I found that passage so moving because here they are, right? They've been holding on, hoping. And then at some point, somebody says to them, "This is the end." And by the way, here's Zeena Regis.
Right.
And you're now in this place of companioning not just the person who's dying, but also the family
Mhm.
through the last days, which can be fast, but it can also take a little bit of time. And how how do you help them understand the grief spiritually, or just process? Like, where do you go with that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting space because I know it from both sides. Well, not in the same way, but I remember my father was had just had like quadruple bypass surgery, and they asked if he wanted a chaplain, and he was like, "No, I have my chaplain."
Mm-hmm.
But like I wasn't his chaplain, I'm his daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and so. Um, anyway, I just always think of that moment being like, you still need a chaplain, because I think the work of the chaplain is, I've come to love the concept of holding space. And I really love it in so many ways. Like one of the things I think of often is how distracted we are. And even in the time from I started as a chaplain in 2012, which wasn't even that long ago, to 2020, it seems like our capacity for distraction has exponentially grown. Like even at the bedside of the dying, I've seen a change in how we relate as humans. Like if we're on the phone, if we're on, if we're on our smartphone, if we're on our watching TV or whatever, I've seen that shift. And so what I see as my role is really helping people create a space to see that they're in this sacred moment. It's a difficult moment, but it's holy, and like naming it as holy. And so I always, for so many years, I come home to my family and I'm like, I honestly feel like I do nothing but say, let's slow down, let's talk, let's create a space. And people are always like, that was the most amazing visit ever. But I think it's because we just do not have enough spaces for storytelling and sharing and just pauses. And so I think more than anything, that's what I help do, is help pause and say, let's talk about what's important now. Let's talk about legacy. Let's talk about trust. Let's talk about your values and how we can infuse this moment with all of those things. And so more than anything, I feel like that is my role. And so I know it's almost cliche, but to let others lead, but that's exactly what I do. Like, I'm like, tell me what you value, tell me what you want out of this time. Um, Tell me what's important to you. But the interesting thing is that because we're so distracted, we often don't know um, what is important, and what we do value, and like where our focus is going. And so just helping people slow that down and get in touch with that. Um, as I always feel like it's my biggest role. So when I actually just called a family this morning to be like, can I come as a chaplain? And they're like, no, we have a pastor. And I'm like, I don't want to compete with your pastor at all, but like my skill set is different. And so let me come. And usually if they let me come once, they're like, okay, yeah, you're fine. You can keep coming. We want you to keep coming. But it's just understanding that it's a different type of role, and like it's not about me coming in and posing anything. It's about me opening up space so you can make this a holy moment. And not always, holy is not even the word. Like I work with a lot of people who have no spiritual orientation per se, but just the weightiness and the mystery of this, because no matter what we believe, we know that death is a great mystery. Like we know that there's something there we cannot articulate, and so just helping people have a little space to say, I don't know what this is, so and I don't know how to navigate it, and just giving people a few tools is always just so helpful, no matter what they might be.
You mentioned this sort of holding space and this well, I was struck by it because I feel like we actually just don't really know how to listen in this culture. We're so busy, and also it feels really hard to receive. A lot of people have a hard time receiving. And so, you know, I think one of the greatest gifts that I can give as a minister and as a spiritual companion, and maybe this is the same for you, is just listening to somebody. And it's just remarkable. I think people feel really thankful. And part of it is, I think they just don't actually encounter it that often. And it's like it's the simplest thing to do. And yet so few people seem to know how to just sit and be present.
Yeah,
And it's so remarkably healing for folks.
it is. Yeah.
And I don't know really what it is that um, about the human condition that needs to try to interject or like problem solve or make somebody feel okay when, by the time they are seeing you, probably the last thing they want to say, you can't really say, oh, it's going to be all right.
Right. Yeah. I actually the biggest lesson I think I've learned as a chaplain is I was doing CPE, clinical pastoral education, as part of my chaplaincy training. And I remember my supervisor, we had to do these verbatims and all that we did and the conversations. Anyway, she was reading through one of my verbatim, and I honestly thought I had done excellent chaplain work. I'm like, I said the right things. Like, yes, I was on like all of my book. Like I'd read all these books like Final Gifts and What Do People Need When They're Dying. And like I was on it. And I remember she just looked at it and was like we went through it, read it, and she was like, there's no Holy Saturday here.
Mm,
And
I
you rush
love
straight,
that.
yeah, you rush straight to resurrection. And that has guided my chaplaincy since then. Like this idea, like I had went straight from Good Friday, like the crucifixion, to like we're celebrating, like your loved one's going to be in heaven. And so
Mm-hmm,
that is actually my mantra: don't rush to resurrection.
mm-hmm,
People have to sit in Holy Saturday. And it's so interesting that like at that time in CPE, I wasn't even working in hospice. My first internship as a chaplain was in a prison.
oh wow.
And so she had seen me rushing to resurrection in a prison, and it's a completely different context. And so, but it was such a perfect, it's become such the perfect mantra for my work in chaplaincy in hospice. Like I actually probably need to call her and thank her right now. But um, because that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted people to feel better, whatever that meant. And like, it's like, at that time these women are incarcerated, they have lost so much, and so my like empty words of like feeling better were just not like, that's not it, like that's not what they need. They need to be heard. You
Mm-hmm,
need to allow people to sit in Holy Saturday. And so that has become really my mom. I mean, and I even found myself in the beginning of my chaplaincy in hospice trying to do the same thing, trying to say the right things to make people feel better. But I mean, it just became clear that's not what people need. That's not what, yeah, we need to be heard in a way that you just spoke to. We don't hear that, and we don't allow that in our culture. And one of my favorite moments, this was really early in my chaplaincy. I was a chaplain for a very, very young man who was dying from complications from HIV and AIDS. His family did not know about his diagnosis. He went to the hospital for like a cold respiratory thing and ended up being in there like 6 or 7 weeks.
mm,
But he was so young, probably in his early 20s. And I remember, and not that this matters, but just this beautiful, beautiful person.
mm-hmm,
He was very active on social media, and like so all his friends were like bringing me his like Instagram pages and all that. So but his mother, when it became clear that he was going to die, she called everybody. There had to be 30 people in his hospital room. Um, but she asked me, I felt like a bouncer. She asked me to take everybody's cell phone because she said, my son's outward aesthetics were so important to him. I don't want them taking pictures of him in this state. And so
mm-hmm,
that was just really important to her. But anyway, so she was like, before anybody comes in, you take. So I had this basket full of like early 20s cell phones. Like they all had it. But the holiness in that room of everybody having to focus and like be with this, we were extubating him, taking him from life support. And making that moment holy. And just, I remember one young woman who couldn't have been 19 started to sing, and like the whole room burst into song. And like, I always think about that young man having this holy death of presence because he was surrounded by the people he loved who were singing and praying and holding his hands. And it was one of the most beautiful metaphors for presence and helping people create the space. And because in the beginning, I just said, we want to make this what you want it to be. We want this to be sacred and holy space. And they took it. And like that memory of like dozens of people standing around, actually physically creating holy space for this young man as he transitioned is just something that will always stick with me because they listened, they told stories about him, they listened to one another, and then they prayed him into the beyond. And it was beautiful. And so I think about that so much.
I'm like that story. I actually started tearing up when I heard that
Mhm.
story. It's so like what a gift, and
Beautiful.
what presence on the behalf of the mother to also really recognize what this moment was.
Yeah.
For everybody.
Yes. Yes. It was, yeah, it was. It was just because I remember being like, I don't want to take everybody's. I mean, I don't want to be that. But once I did and was completely comfortable with that, and I remember no one asked for it back. Like,
Mm.
like, of course, and like I had to remind them, like, when y'all leave, get your cell phone because everybody has been so like in this holy transformative space. And though his death was a tragedy in so many ways,
Hmm.
that was one of the most beautiful good deaths I think I've ever seen, um, ever. Yeah.
And it really, listening to you say all that, it to me it brings this really interesting point about our culture, which is how much we try to avoid the suffering. And you know, I see there's this huge like world of apps now that's like listen to these things of it'll
Yeah.
de-stress and all of these things, and I'm all about it. Like stress is tough, anxiety is tough, and perhaps one of the things we need to do is actually get a little closer, like embrace what's happening here. That running from the grief isn't it isn't gonna do the thing that you think it's gonna do.
Yeah. No. And that has been kind of the biggest lesson for me in my own life is that I know there's all the like you can't you can't go to it without going through it and all the things that
Mm-hmm.
people say, but
Mm-hmm.
it is so very true when it comes to grief work. Like there is no like free pass to get through grief. Um, and I lead some grief support groups, and it's usually, I'm not going to say all the time, but so many of the people who sign up are people whose loss happened longer than they're like, they're I had a grief support group once, and like the median age of the loss that they were coming to process was like 6 years, because they had felt like,
Oh wow.
like I'm gonna get over the death of my husband by staying busy or by doing this and doing that. And so it's like they came 6 years later to say, I'm still not okay. I never processed it. I never dealt with it. So it's something that we all have to deal with, and it comes up in so many ways. And so um and once people find out that I do grief work, they come to me and they're like, fix me. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
sad. Like I'm sad. I don't like feeling sad. Fix me. What do I need to do? What are the 3 steps that I need to do to not
Mm.
feel sad? And so actually going back to what that my chaplaincy supervisor, I talk a lot about Holy Saturday and like how we
Mm-hmm.
have to sit in there. Like we cannot, and I think even our culture in some ways has I there's nothing bad about celebrating celebrations of life. But it's this whole idea that comes like, I don't we're not, I mean, and you hear people even working in a hospice working in hospice is so interesting to hear what people say the moment of death. But often it's like, you can't be sad. You got to celebrate their life. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, my partner of 53 years just died. Like,
Hmm.
we're allowed to be sad. So even just giving people the permission to grieve, I think that's the most of my work is saying, like, you can grieve. Like, and your grief doesn't need to look like anybody. And pointing people, the great vast majority of the people I work with come from a Christian background.
Hmm.
But reintroducing them to like lament in the Bible is always a tool because there's been this idea co-opting a lot of Christianity that you can't question God, you can't get mad at God. But I'm like, that's not biblical. Like you have David saying like, why was I even like what are you doing, God? Like, why did you just leave me wherever I was? Like, why would you do this? Like, and so sharing with people like this is part of your faith tradition and it's
Hmm.
okay. Is such I think that has been more than anything of my grief work is to tell people it's okay to grieve. Like you don't have to be quote unquote strong. You don't have to celebrate the life today. Like you can grieve the life. You don't have to celebrate it. But people are like, no, they're in heaven. And so it's like this, I don't know, there's just this weird divorce from feeling like we just don't even like in this culture we just are like we're not going to do that like this is and I've even had people say like when I've done funerals and memorial services I don't want you to set the sad tone and I'm like okay like it's sad so we're allowed
Yeah.
to set the sad tone we're allowed to be in lament we're allowed to be in sorrow we're allowed to grieve and creating that space is so important. And so I've been thinking a lot about the rituals that we just don't have anymore to mark grieving and mourning. And so people are expected to be at work in 3 days and to be okay.
Right.
And so it's actually made me think so much about like how much of the way we grieve and move through things is influenced by our capitalist culture, by our patriarchal culture, this idea of efficiency over all else, and how much that doesn't serve us when we are in the depths of despair and have to be productive. So, yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, you just said so much. That is, um, that we've lost keening. We've lost just like it's embarrassing to wail now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why would that ever be embarrassing? But that's how we're supposed to. And you're right. You're supposed to be back at work. Um, you're supposed to show up for people that you don't need to show up for.
Yes, yes, that's what I'm always like. No, you don't need to go for that. And it's like
Yeah,
that is the messaging of our culture. Like
it
you
is.
need to show, and even, and I work. I always say I'm going to write a piece on like what it means to be like what it does to your psyche to always be called an angel. Because anytime I say I work in hospice, people are like, "You're an angel," and then they
Mm-hmm.
probably stop talking to me. But so like, but hospice is this interesting place where you think because we're around death, we'd actually talk about it, but we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And we're many of the staff are uncomfortable with just what you named wailing, and so I or crying or any outward mourning makes
Mm-hmm.
people really uncomfortable. And so 9 times out of 10, if I get called out for an emergency, like you need to come, it's because somebody's wailing. And when I'm on the phone with the nurse who's calling me, I'm like, their loved one just died. It's okay that they wail. And they're like,
Right.
come out and stop them. Like it is, they're doing it too much. And I'm afraid. But it's like we really don't want to make others uncomfortable. And we don't want to be uncomfortable. But like death and grief and dying, like all of those spaces are just uncomfortable spaces. They're uncomfortable to be in and they are uncomfortable to witness. And so I think part of our culture is moved to a point where we want that segregated and we don't want to hear about it because we don't want to be made uncomfortable by anyone else's grief. And that's even in hospice spaces. I've worked probably for about 4 hospices, and that culture is everywhere. Like they are out of control is what I hear all the time. Like
Mm,
they are just, she's rolling on the floor. Nobody needs to roll on the floor. And I'm like, but you do. Like sometimes you
hmm.
do roll on the floor. So yeah, it's interesting to see that even in hospice culture, like that it's not like visible mourning, expressive mourning is just frowned upon. And so that's been interesting to see.
And I'm just making a connection now that I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. But you were on this really wonderful podcast called 1001 New Worshiping Communities, and you were talking about actually the systemic racism, part of the systemic racism that also appears, well, throughout our culture,
Yeah.
but in the hospital situation. And so I'm just drawing this out a little bit now. So we were in the fall of 2020, and we were experiencing, earlier in the year, really a lot of, well, what people were calling protests,
Yeah.
right? And just having this conversation with you now, there's almost this part of me that's just, was that not keening? Was that not wailing?
Mm.
I mean, there was anger and we need reform and we need all of this, but just the massive amount of grief that has come through the Black community due to, well, systemic racism, but just centuries of police violence, unaccountable police
Yeah.
violence of Black men, Black people, but in particular Black men being murdered and not being held accountable. But then, so just again bringing it back to where you work most of the time in the hospitals or in at home, visiting people at home, when you're serving, when you're companioning people through the final stages, knowing what you know and knowing what, and they know also that systemic racism has is prevalent within the medical field,
Yeah.
and they're dealing with the grief of someone dying, and perhaps either dealing with the certainty or uncertainty of knowing whether, if they'd been white,
Mm.
they would have received care that would have kept them alive, which is sort of another level of grief. Or And so as a Black woman, like navigating this space, companioning these people, how do you navigate that space?
Yeah, that you made such an important point about the demonstrations and the riots. I mean, not riots, the protests that were happening.
Yeah, the
That's what
uprising.
yeah, the uprising.
Yeah.
Um, my background before I went to seminary is I was a community organizer, and when all that first started happening, I went right into my community organizing mode of what are we asking for? Like
Mm-hmm.
what are the demands that we're making? What are the policy changes we're asking? And it was fine. It was actually one day, actually in my quiet time, my meditation, that I was like, this is not, this is grief gone public. This is
Mm-hmm.
mourning. This is not about, I mean, in some ways it's about policy, but really is Dr. Alan Wolfelt calls mourning grief gone public. And I like that. I like that definition. But like I was like, that's exactly what this is. This is grief gone public. This is the mourning we need to do in order not to die, in order not to just completely collapse. Um, and so that realization really helped me in so many ways because I'm like, this is because we don't know what to do with this. And I see that also in healthcare because it is, you don't know. It's like in this suspended state of like, is this racism? Like living as a Black person in America is always to be in that that neuroses of like,
Right.
is this the natural order of things, or did this happen because I was denied something? Like, and to see it in my work, and I've actually become like, I really feel like in addition to holding space, my other job as a chaplain is advocacy, because even the subtle ways that healthcare professionals label patients impacts their care. So, where a white family can be seen as advocating lovingly for a family, a Black person will be seen as angry and demanding. And so that completely impacts. If someone gives you a report and says, I just met with this family and they are demanding and angry, that impacts how you walk into that room. No matter if you want to think so or not, it really impacts how you're going, if you're going to be guarded, what you're going to offer, what you're going to, the kind of conversation you're going to have. And so I see that on this large scale. And so it's like all of these little things in addition to these huge things about, like, I read these studies where medical professionals don't think Black people experience pain in the same way that white people do. There are all these things that are like
That's
against
like,
you.
I'm laughing almost out of like, I don't even know what to do with that. Like that was,
Right. It's and to also be a Black woman navigating that same healthcare system for myself, and to know, like, I've been thinking a lot about how hospice and also maternal care, because um, Black women are like something like 30 times more likely to die in childbirth. Actually, I'm raising my nephew, um, whose mother died from complications from pregnancy and childbirth. And so seeing that up close and wondering myself, is she dead because people didn't take her symptoms seriously? Because the healthcare professionals did not take her symptoms seriously. Is that why my nephew no longer has a mother? Um, so it's things like that, like being like feeling it definitely in my own life, and then seeing it kind of this wide scale of people. And it's also very like it's it's so interesting how racism and bias can seem so very reasonable sometimes. Like, it's like, reasonable is not the word, but like the gaslighting, like this is
yeah,
normal.
yeah.
Like, it's supposed to be this way. This happened because they are sick, or because they're diabetic, or they're non-compliant. That's a big buzzword. Like, they're non-compliant. They didn't manage their own care, and so this is. But then when you look at the like totality of their interactions with the healthcare, they were never listened to. They were
Hmm.
never given space to really talk about what was going on with their healthcare. And so just seeing that over and over again, people saying, like, it wasn't that I wasn't going to the doctor, it was that they said my symptom of back pain was from me being overweight or whatever it is. Like, and so no one ever looked to see that, oh, it actually was pancreatic cancer or whatever it is. And so to see that over and over again, and to know that I'm also a part of a system that in some ways perpetuates that, is deeply painful. And so I always see that as like, that is my role. If I can even, and I don't know if everybody is familiar with the Enneagram, but I'm an Enneagram 9.
Okay. I'm a 4.
Um, so it's very difficult for me to be
Mm.
adversarial, but
Hmm.
like, I've just been saying, like, that is the space that I have to claim, to say, why are we saying they're non-compliant? And actually, my way of being that is asking questions. So, what did they do that made you say that? And people are always like, they ain't questions. But I just feel like that's my role,
I love
because
that. Yeah.
that's what I have to do. But yeah, just seeing that over and over again, it's and always not knowing. It's the not knowing. Like, no, we don't have an alternate universe. We don't have a sliding doors type movie where we can see, if I had been this would not have happened. But just to know deep in your spirit, like, that's why this person who shouldn't be hospice is now here, and who is going to die in an early death because they did not receive the health care they were entitled to, or that they should have been entitled to.
You know what? We're gonna wrap up in a second, and I just wanted to actually bring it to you, if I
Okay.
can,
Yeah.
in terms of, sometimes I think of people who have the role that you do, which is, sometimes I think about people who operate in some of these, in the more sort of peripheral ministries, like I preach from a pulpit. It's the very recognized one. That's a very recognized ministry. But
Yeah.
there are these almost shamanic ones that live on the edge, that people get very nervous about,
Mm.
right? You can be a chaplain to a fire department, and that's, you get a lot of kudos and credits. But if you're a hospice chaplain, there's almost like a danger,
Mm.
that because you're associated with death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet here you are called to this, that somewhere in your relationship with God, in your contemplative space, in, you know, in your connection to the divine, this has been the path for you.
Mm.
And so I'm just curious about how your relationship with God has brought you here.
Mm.
As a woman, as a Black woman, as a, person living in the South, like all of these different modalities that have given you this voice, this Enneagram 9, who it has been chosen really to sit with the dying, to sit
Mm.
with those who are grieving when nobody else wants to experience grief.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's been an interesting journey. More than anything, like I remember when I was first, so I was working in prison as an intern and loved it. That's how I became to love chaplaincy. And in Georgia, we've had lots of cuts in the Department of Corrections, and chaplains are now volunteer chaplains, and that could be a whole nother
Mm-hmm.
episode.
Yeah.
But at the time, there just were not a lot of positions for a chaplain. And so my supervisor, the one that don't rush to resurrection supervisor, said, I think you'd be really good as a hospice chaplain. You just have that, something about you just tells me that would be good for you. And I remember being like, she's right. That could either be really good or really bad. Because I was one of those kids who, and now that I've said it, so many people are like, "Oh, I resonate with that." But I would like wake up in the middle of the night and be like, "I'm going to die." Like it's like like have terror. Like what does this mean? Like, and I would have to get up out of the bed and like contemplate and write about it and like there was just always this acute awareness of like mortality. So I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
either it could go bad or great. Um, and so I think that being part of my background and just always recognizing that death is not theoretical, like it's coming, um, has helped me in this work. And so I think, and outside of that too, I've always had this faith that is so not able to be contained in one space or in
Mm-hmm.
one box. And so even as a child, I just remember having all these like questions about why is it this or why do we say this? And so I think that combination of being very very being very very comfortable with questions has served me well in this work. I do not have any answers, and I like that is like how I lead everything. Like I don't have any answers. um God is the answer, like God, or your conception of God, spirit, mystery. That is where the answers lie, and that is you, and in your communion between that and you, that's where the answers lie. I'm just here to kind of guide you in that, because that's always what I've found. Like there are no answers. Like there's got to be, my answers have to come from within. And so that has helped me, because when people I always tell the story because it just, like, it's one of my favorite moments as a chaplain. But I had this gentleman. He was my favorite patient. He's one of my favorite patients ever. But he was just so irreverent and everything. And one day he says, like, "Chaplain, I have a question for you." And I'm thinking we're going to have this big theological conversation. And he's like, is there going to be weed in heaven? And I'm like, I don't know. But we had a great conversation about it. And I'm like, that is going to be the title of my memoir. Is there weed in heaven?
Mm-hmm.
Because but we were able to have that conversation because I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what heaven looks like. I don't know I don't know if there's marijuana in heaven. He had found a lot of relief from his symptoms with marijuana
Mm-hmm.
and wanted to make sure that was going to be in the afterlife. But more than anything, I felt like he was asking, will my whole self be accepted into this afterlife?
Mm-hmm.
Will every part of me, which includes being a very active marijuana smoker,
Mm-hmm.
will that be accepted in heaven? And so that has kind of been my spiritual approach is like my whole self um, is accepted by the divine, and I want people to feel like their whole self is accepted by the divine. And so that's my spiritual journey. That's the spiritual journey that I want for everyone to be able to be on, and to be able to define their spirituality and their divinity and their faith the way that accepts all parts of them, um, and doesn't force us to be pretty and to like wrapped up in a bow, and like so many of us have been taught to believe that you will only be accepted if you do these things. And so I think that's the path that I've always been on. Like, what does it mean to be integrated? What does it mean to what is a holistic understanding of salvation? What is a holistic understanding of acceptance and trust and faith? And so, just working through those questions for me, I think have made me a better chaplain, because I think when it boils down, that's what people want to know, is that they are accepted fully, in their humanity, and also in their spirituality. And so that's where I journey, and so that's where I'm always inviting other people to journey to as well.
Thank you so much, Zeena. I feel like we could just, I mean, I feel like we need to do some follow up because this conversation it's actually left me with a lot more questions. But you can,
That's wonderful.
yeah, you can find out more by visiting her website, which is zeenaregis.com. That's ZEENAREGIS.com. And I'll also put some links to the other podcast that she was on, the 1001 Worshiping Communities, where you can hear her share a little more, and also the link to the Medium article that I quoted, which I just thought was really fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the Seeker's Table, Zeena, and I just
And a
really appreciate it
pleasure.
and really enjoyed the conversation. So
You too.
thank you.
Thank you.
Oops.